projection mode now. So it's a pleasure to be here again and talk to you. And since yesterday, my talk changed actually systematically. I want to share so many things with you, but what I did is I rearranged the talk and I essentially focused on three elements that are connected with each other, that are linking actually to some of the aspects we heard yesterday, but also linking to symmetry in large-scale brain networks and giving rise to emergent properties in functional brain imaging data. So the first part I'd like to emphasize is the following, linked to self-organization, in particular synergetics, and in systems with symmetries. Yesterday we heard Herman Haken talking about synergetics, giving us a reminder of how it's organized, and within a few seconds I'd like to do that also. Yeah, what we are having is a high-dimensional state vector entitled Q here, typically very high-dimensional, following an evolution equation, a nonlinear evolution equation that can be formulated in terms of a time derivative, Q dot on the left-hand side, and with a dependence on the external control parameter on the right-hand side, sigma. Yeah, and these sigma we can actually vary. They are under experimental control, and when we get to a critical point, then actually the local center manifold theorem comes in, allows us to find a subspace in the large dimensional state space. And as we approach a critical point in which a bifurcation occurs, a phase transition in some other domains it's being called, yeah, there is we are crossing with one of the eigenvectors, typically the real part of lambda, the eigenvalue through the zero axis, that employs a timescale separation, which allows us actually to perform a dimension reduction, an enormous dimension reduction. It allows us to decompose the systems into its eigenvectors and time-dependent coefficients psi I, and rewrite the high-dimensional system in terms of rewrite it locally here at this point, where the leading part, because it's a fixed point, disappears, it's zero. We can perform a linearization, express this in terms of a Jacobian, and express the higher order terms in terms of a Taylor decomposition. Yeah? And then what we can do is we can go and identify the modes that correspond to a slow parameter scale, so that are closest to the bifurcation, as the unstable modes that are dominating the other dynamics in terms of order parameters, and apply the principle of adiabatic elimination, which is based on the local center manifold. So we are here in this region of the subspace, and allows us to express the dynamics autonomously of all the other modes that are referred to as the enslaved modes. Yeah? And that allows us actually to arrive at a low dimensional description, where this is the order parameter dynamics, often 1-2 dimensional, and express the dynamics of all the other modes. Yeah? That's what we have seen in synergetics. Yeah? One of the key points here is that we need to operate the control parameter sigma close to a bifurcation point. The question is, are there some other principles that we can evoke in order to actually obtain the timescale separation and operate close to a particular working point without necessarily going directly to a bifurcation, but allows us to obtain an enslaving of the other degrees of freedom? Yeah? And the answer is yes, to a certain degree. There are symmetries in the system. In particular, there are symmetries. We are going back here to this high-dimensional evolution equation. There are symmetries in the system where now the expression sigma is not necessarily denoting anymore driving from the outside, but I wish to identify a symmetry parameter, mu, where when we are at the full symmetry in the system, yeah, that generates invariant manifolds in the state space. So this is a state space that allows us to move around the manifold. Here you have a representation thereof. This is a manifold that is defined by the flow of zero in here in the condition of perfect symmetry. You can move along the manifold. There is no flow in there, so it's composed of fixed points. Yeah. And if the manifold is attractive, all flow goes from wherever outside of the manifold to the system. And under the smallest type of symmetry breaking, yeah, a flow arises on the manifold, and we have a timescale separation again, because of the symmetry within the manifold, the fact that there is a symmetry condition that translates into an eigenvalue of 0, that it goes along the manifold here, and actually established as that timescale separation. Systems with this type of symmetries are called equivariant dynamical system. And here what we are having is actually, you can take group theoretical approaches. So this here would be a continuous group that allows actually to trace out the symmetry. I want to give you an explicit example. Before I do this, let me formulate this mathematically. So now, we go back to this particular system. We choose an operation point. In this case, as an example, connectivity. Yeah. If mu is equal 0, we have all-to-all connectivity, or if omega 0 is 0 and fully unconnected system. Yeah. And the mu is a symmetry breaking term. Yeah. What we can then do is we go back into the high dimensional system, and we can perform actually a variation. One variation is so first of all, if we put mu equals 0, so one variation is around mu, then this is by definition 0, the fully symmetric case. And then we can perform two more variations. First variation in mu around the symmetry breaking term. So this gives us the variation around the connectivity if mu is a symmetry breaking term here. And the second one is we perform a variation around the deviations away from the manifold. Yeah, so Q0 is indicating the manifold of the invariant manifold, and mu the deviations from it. And this resembles, if the manifold were a fixed point, this here would be a Jacobian, but it's not. So this turns it into a functional, essentially. So it becomes a fully nonlinear function. This expression here is actually representative of the manifold. And this function, the symmetry breaking, determines the flow on the manifold. In a very simple toy example, please have a look at this here. Here I'm representing this as a two-dimensional system on the right-hand side. The first expression in terms of psi, this is a manifold, yeah. It's evident that this represents a circle. Plus, for mu equals 0, these two equations are identical, and we have an invariant circular manifold. And for mu non-equal 0, we break the symmetry. If we go into the state space of the system, spanned here, first axis, second axis, for mu equals 0, the null lines can be are on top of each other. And this circle here represents a manifold with no symmetry breaking. Now, a little bit of symmetry breaking here, in which for mu non-equal 0 actually shifts the two circles, the two null lines, away from each other, and we have intersections. This becomes a stable fixed point, another stable fixed point in red, another stable fixed point, depending on where it intersects. And in black, we have the unstable fixed points. And what you see here up to the right are the time series of one dimension and another dimension, and the trajectories in state space. Yeah, and you see the perpendicular orientation going to the manifold indicates that we have actually a timescale separation present. Yeah, and when we adiabatically eliminate the system, we can express all the other modes in terms of the dynamics of U, and U being the system that is determined here on the spherical manifold. In the present of noise, essentially what the dynamics is doing, we will use this later on, the dynamics goes down on the manifold, hangs out, stays on the manifold, and actually samples the shape of the manifold. I can do this same now not in a 2-dimensional, but in a 20-dimensional system. And in this case, mathematically, you see what you have. Instead of a circular, you have a spherical manifold, yeah, which is a 2-dimensional surface that you have represented here. To the left and to the right, the rotating object is the same. Only on the right, I added the sphere for better visualization. It's a 20-dimensional system, yeah. Everything is contracted down on the manifold. And then here a symmetry breaking, which generates actually a bistability here. You see 2 fixed points generated on the spherical manifold. Trajectories are being attracted, goes down, and then through the noise, it samples the manifold, and then it's being kicked out across the separatrix and goes down on the other case, on the other fixed point. What I wanted to communicate here with you is that there are principles rooted in symmetry on the one hand side that allows us to generate invariant sets within the state space that when control parameters are being changed can become attractive, and the symmetry breaking can then generate a meaningful dynamics that is being that is tracing out the dynamics on top of the manifold, and the dimensional reduction occurs due to the symmetry breaking and the timescale separation. Keep this in mind. And what is happening then, driven by noise, we see the system is being attracted down to this low-dimensional subset and is sampling the manifold, as you see here in this particular case, even though there are some deterministic features on it. That is the mindset. Yeah. So in the next 2 points that I want to communicate is, number one, spatial-temporal symmetry that is in the connectome. Yeah, because we are talking about the brain, and here you have a representation of the connectome, and we have heard a few talks with regard to this, that is spanning a network here in 3-dimensional physical space. Graph theory is typically applied to this in order to characterize it. So we talked about topology in the previous talks has been talked about. But then also, please look at this. There are certain lengths associated with it. So there is more to it. There is a space-time structure to the connectivity because there are time delays associated with that that have not been discussed so much in the literature. Let me go to the next slide. And when talking about graph theory applied to the characterization of a network like this, what is hidden behind that is actually a picture of information processing that I wish to refer to as a particle picture of information processing, because hubs seem to play a role. Or hidden assumption, without saying it explicitly, is also when you have many connections going in. Yes, so you have a lot. A single point is very strongly connected and has many afferent connections. This is implied to be meaningful, which means lots of information is going behind that. There is an activity-based system thinking behind that in terms of particles that are being exchanged. When we talk about oscillations, though, the situation changes, because when you look at this representation here, F equals 0 is a particle picture. But when you have oscillations, it's actually more a synchronization picture that matters, because when the time delay, here represented as t, is being changed, actually an in-phase synchronization, as you change the time delay, can change actually an excitational pattern from in-phase to actually anti-phase when the time shift is appropriate. Yeah. For synchronization, this is a wave picture, yeah, for information processing. But this does not is represented by this picture here. Actually, the correct picture as a fundamental canonical model of communication is actually an oscillator picture, or in the simplest terms, something like the Kuramoto equation, where you have phase-coupled oscillators, where you have a connection strength in here. Yeah, can be plus or minus, but let's stick to plus, and a time delay, because the time delay can actually shift the phasing of the information. And for the long fibers in a connectome as here, this can play a very important role. Yeah. Now, when you perform a little bit of mathematics, you can extract the time delay in here. yeah, and actually compute when you have two oscillators, yeah, you can actually compute the time shift and perform a renormalization of the connection strength here, k times cosine omega tau, where the tau is the time delay between the two oscillators, and omega a particular frequency. Yeah, you can actually generalize this for more complex connectome patterns under certain conditions, and renormalize the interconnection weight by cosine omega tau, so it becomes spectrally frequency dependent and has a time delay. And that's what Sparsi-Petkowski, my colleague, and myself are proposing, is a renormalization of the connectome, because when you drive this through either with the frequency or the propagation speed via the time delay, you can actually change a connectome type network. And when you change the frequency, you can actually start synchronizing two patterns, in phase in blue, in phase in red, but anti-phase with each other, and you can actually reorganize the dynamics, yeah, by changing the time delays. You can do this systematically, now renormalizing the connectome, which gives you completely different renormalization patterns. And this is now coming from the Human Connectome project, 100 brains. When you apply graph theoretical approaches to the characterization thereof, you obtain, you renormalize the connectome, and for low frequencies, this is the familiar in-strength or the familiar dynamic core, which provides you with the clustering behavior in the connectome. But when you increase the frequency, as you see here, in-strength or dynamic core, the system actually reorganizes completely, and you get different properties of the metrics. You can also do this systematically now and put an Hopf oscillator on every node in the matrix, and then compute phase clusterings dependent on the frequency, increasing frequency from 10 to 80 hertz. Can compute the corresponding functional connectivity or phase clustering and average that. Here, of all the phase clustered indices, they are being plotted here. And as you see, for different frequencies, actually the clustering properties of the network change. For 40 hertz, we have, for instance, bistable properties. For 50, the phase tendencies completely become unbiased. And at 80 hertz, you have more in-phase tendencies. Yeah. See also that the functional connectivity changes. And you can actually go back into the system and ask, is there a resonance body? Yeah. In the connectome based on its topology, but also based on its time delay distribution, so the length of the fibers. Yeah, so based on the renormalized connectome, you can do this. And let's go. This is being plotted here as a function of the frequencies: delta, theta, alpha, beta, low gamma, and high gamma, and then represented for the interior resting state networks, plotted here for 100 subjects from the connectome, renormalizing the connectome and identifying the corresponding resonating frequencies that are favoring actually the different networks. And here you have the corresponding spatial distributions that go with this resonating property. Or alternatively, you can actually plot it and ask what are the resonance properties of the individual networks based on the space-time structure of the connectome. If we focus on this one, for instance, the visual network, there is no bias given whatsoever. It comes purely out of the topology of the network and the existence, the distribution of the time delays, namely the physical length of the fibers. You find that essentially the alpha frequency emerges very naturally for the visual network as a resonating property. Yeah. Or if you go to the default mode network, we see this better here. To the default mode network, we have actually biases in the beta range and in the alpha range for the default mode network. Yeah. So these are the type of properties you can extract when you look for symmetries in the system, connectome system, but not only looking at the topology, as we discussed it in the previous talks, but also take the space-time structure, so the temporal distribution with the length of the fibers of the delays into account. There was a question earlier with regard to this, whether there is physical space. If you believe that oscillations matter in a wave picture for the brain, this is the type of approach that actually needs to be taken. Yeah? Let's take these things together now taking the ideas of manifolds and symmetries in a large-scale network that is spanned by a system with space-time structure and carry it into imaging applications. And the remaining 5 minutes I would actually like to use to talk about this with regard to the resting state, just to give you a gut feeling for how this connects. Yeah, so I'm making reference to resting state activity. As we image it in fMRI bolt data, here, this is the connectome, structural connectome. Here, this is a bolt signal that can be measured across 20 minutes. This would be the stationary or static functional connectivity. But it's also well known by now that it's non-stationary. You can shift it through the time, and with a window of 2 or 3 minutes, you can compute functional connectivity and it changes. And often this dynamics of the functional connectivity has been quantified, has been called either dynamic functional connectivity or functional connectivity dynamics, depending on the author. You can actually take subsequent windows in terms of 2 different time points, can project it onto each other, compute the Pearson cross-correlation coefficient between 2 functional connectivity matrices, and then plot it over time. Here, this is time by time. This is referred to as the dynamic functional connectivity or functional connectivity dynamics. And you find structure in here. Yeah. And here, for the data set that I just showed you, you find these are minutes now. If this is 20 minutes, this here lasts for 2 to 3 minutes. Then you have again 2 to 3 minutes. So you have subspaces in here, illustrated here. This is a data set. Yeah, you have subspaces in which the system samples a subspace, a low-dimensional subspace, so invariant functional connectivity. And then within 1 or 2 data points, it goes somewhere else in the subspace, such that actually it loses a cross-correlation in the functional connectivity and starts sampling another subspace. Yeah, we can do this through a modeling approach. So these were empirical data. We can now take the connectome and span it as a high-dimensional system, pretty much as I showed it to you earlier, and scale it with G being the scaling factor of the connectivity. If G is 0, all the nodes are unconnected, and then I can increase the G scaling of the connectome, and it starts putting dependencies in the system. It starts breaking the symmetry. When the system is completely symmetric in the subspace, if you project in the subspace, these are just some leading eigenmodes here, then of course you have spherical symmetry. The system is symmetric. There is no symmetry breaking in there, and these are identical network nodes. And then you increase the G here. Here you have the corresponding functional connectivity dynamics, the corresponding FCDs, and you see at these places structure emerges, which corresponds to the emergence of these manifolds in there that have a particular flow. Let me show you the flow actually. This is now in the point where this structure emerges. This is FCD, where we are going through the time. And here I'm plotting the functional connectivity with a sliding window. Here you see the corresponding activation patterns. And as the time evolves, you see how the manifold is actually sampled. And these epochs of invariant functional connectivity correspond to samplings of part of the manifolds. This is a very low dimensional projection, of course. Yeah? So the manifolds themselves are higher dimensional, but you see that there is a structure also visually accessible by eye, corresponding to this image of manifolds that arises actually due to the space-time structure that we have in the connectome. Yeah? What happens during an epoch of invariant functional connectivity? So epoch of invariant functional connectivity means I'm going in here and I'm looking in there. And I can do this in the modeled system, and I can do this because it's a model system. I can go into regions of interest, or I can actually compute the edge functional connectivity, yeah, between, so co-activations between 2 nodes, and trace it over time. This is time. This is time. From the model, what we see, there are cascades actually during a period of, here you see the functional connectivity dynamics. During a period of invariant functional connectivity dynamics, we see actually cascades, avalanches, emerging and propagating fast through the network. We see it also in the bolt data, because from here we can compute the forward solution and compute the corresponding bolt signal. And then we can perform some statistics and correlate the nature of the cascades within an invariant functional connectivity, where it's highly correlated between events, so inter-events and non-event correlations. This is a different regime coming from simulations. This is mouse data. Please recognize the same thing in mouse data, where we have in bolt data, empirical data, similar effect, also statistically significant. And here, coming from 15 human subjects, I'm plotting one subject's simultaneous EEG and fMRI data, region of interest, these cascades. Now, when you know what you have to look for, you can actually find them. Yeah, here, the edge functional connectivity, region of interest, functional connectivity dynamics between these, and here the corresponding statistics of event-event avalanches propagating through this. So this is actually what is happening. Avalanches are propagating through the network. I'm skipping this slide for time reasons. Avalanches are propagating through the network during epochs of invariant functional connectivity, propagating along the manifold. And they are more similar to each other during parts of the invariant functional connectivity than outside. So events versus non-events. So I'm with you is essentially this type of thinking, symmetry imposing constraints upon high dimensional systems, number one, allowing for adiabatic elimination, timescale separation, leading to a dimension reduction. There are symmetries in the system and symmetry breaking that can come from the connectome, but careful, the connectome has space-time structure. It's not just topology of connectivities. And then the way to think in order to extract this are these low dimensional subspaces that correspond to manifolds. And we can actually find them if we know what we have to look for. I stop here. I thank my team, my dear colleagues and friends, and the team at home, in particular Spase Petkowski, Jan Fosek, Giovanni Rabuffo have contributed a lot to this type of work. Thank you.